Well, hey everybody, my name is Alex Matchneer. I'm a member of Ember.js core team. I'm very excited to be here. I'm also extremely tired. I got in today and maybe got about an hour of sleep on a beanbag in the corner of an office. And if these aren't very well proofread or I start just mumbling, it's probably due to that, so please forgive me.
Put pillows for you?
I'm sorry?
Should we put pillows on the ground for you?
Yeah, maybe if I could maybe have an intermission in the middle of my presentation. You guys yeah, so that would be great if you got that. So Eric kind of signed me up, and I didn't really have a whole lot of time to think about what I wanted to talk about. And then when I realized what I wanted to talk about, it's not even really that like succinct or easy to describe. I really just kind of wanted to talk about a random grab bag of mobile Ember web development stuff that I feel like I hadn't really read a lot online about, but I've had to solve a lot of my own apps and had to come up with some patterns that at some point I'd like to kind of extract in open source and some Ember add-ons and whatnot. So I'm just kind of talking about some random experiences learned from the trenches. So again, my name is Alex Matchneer. I've been working at the startup that I'm somewhere between the co-founder and first employee of for about a year and a half called Express Checkout. It's, as of like a month ago, it's live in a store in California. I'm going to be live in about 2 stores in about a week. And the idea is you just go into a store, scan all the items you want, scan their barcodes, build up a shopping cart, and you're putting stuff in your bag as you go, and you pay on your phone, and ideally just walk out of the store with no hassle, and you can skip the line and all that stuff. So we're trying to make that work. And I'm based out of New York, so right now having a store be a pilot in California means random, 4-hour trips across the continent to check in and see how things are going. So that's been fun. But all the mobile Ember stuff I've been learning has really been building this out. So I guess a common theme of this whole presentation is that most of the Ember web development that people are doing are probably desktop facing with a mouse and lots of real estate to work with and kind of a lot of different assumptions and stuff you have to think about if you're building a mobile web app. And I think mobile is just a lot harder. The assumptions are different, and the kinds of leaks that you need to steal are a lot harder to get right when you're doing mobile. So maybe quick show of hands, who's here has had to do any mobile Ember web development? There's somebody I think was sponsoring. So a few of you, but I'm guessing most of everybody has some experience doing desktop specific stuff. So it kind of becomes a little bit of a different world when you go trying to make something that looks and feels okay in a mobile setup. So first off, I think one thing that we can all agree on is that forms in general, they just kind of always suck. I mean, by forms I just mean input fields, typing, text, and validation and all that stuff. It's just pretty much the worst part of any app as far as the user experience goes, but also even developing it and checking it and making sure it's right. So imagine it being even worse, and that's pretty much what you have to work with in a mobile setup. It is actually, they found a way to make it suck even more. So very specifically, if you want to say after an animation autofocus the next field that they should be typing into, you're going to be entering in a world of pain, or at least extreme disappointment, because it only kind of sort of half works sometimes, but not really, and only kind of works for iOS in a Cordova setup. Oh, by the way, Cordova, are people familiar with that? Cordova is a platform for embedding your web app into a native app, and then it provides all the tools for getting your JavaScript to talk to native code. So for instance, if you want to bring up a camera or a barcode scanner, which is obviously something that my app has to do, you're going to sort of issue these commands over a JavaScript bridge that is really cumbersome to implement yourself, but Cordova kind of does that for you, and Cordova also has a bunch of plugins of extremely varying quality that have been put together.
It's also better known as PhoneGap.
PhoneGap, Cordova, I don't really know. One of them's like the foundation, one of them's the benefactor, one of them's the name of Apache. I'm not good at that stuff, but it used to be just PhoneGap, now it's PhoneGap and Cordova, and when I come across online tutorials telling me to type one or the other in the command line, I don't really know why. It's one or the other.
It was first PhoneGap, and then they got a lawsuit, and then so they named it to Cordova.
Oh, so there's a lawsuit involved. I thought it was just the Apache Foundation,
Yeah,
open sourceifying it.
we'd have to rename it, I think, for Apache.
Okay, so PhoneGap and Cordova, I mean, literally the same thing as far as the developer perspective. So anyways, forms in the mobile web suck even more than they do in desktop, and not just for your user experience, because it's annoying to have to type in a bunch of stuff and actually get to the meat of what your app does, but it's also just really horrible to develop. And in particular, you know, one of the things that's, you kind of want animations in general, even in a lot of desktop apps, just to give you some feedback that something's happening, or to paper over the fact that data's loading from the server, but if something's moving across the screen, maybe you won't notice. But in mobile, it's just super crucial. It's just, since iOS, since the beginning of the iPhone, you just expect these things to be animated, but you try to do it at the same time that you autofocus a field, and then you're going to get your iOS app to flip out and all sorts of other random things that are just inexplicably hard to get right. So another thing to consider is that in iOS and then even Android, you kind of have this fixed header at the top, and you can sort of try and find a way to CSS around it, but it doesn't really work, because if you focus an input field that's like halfway through your page, it's going to shift it all upward, and your header gets cut off because it's been shifted upward. And the only sort of way you can keep that from happening is to enable something in Cordova that locks it into place. But then when you actually do want to intelligently like scroll upwards so you can actually see what you're typing into, it doesn't do that for you. Yeah.
What if you have a header and a footer? Because we had that, and that was not doable
You
at
should
all.
pretty much just close your startup. Pick a new app. We're in a post-footer reality.
Or go React Native.
Or go React Native, because it has a solution to all the problems. It's recorded, right? No one knows if I'm sarcastic or not. It's great. So anyway, you lose auto scroll and it's horrible headers and footers. It's stuff that should be the easiest thing of all time is surprisingly difficult. And anytime my designer gives me a new page with like, oh, it's a form and it autofocuses, and then when you've typed in 3 characters, this one flies in from the bottom and then autofocuses. It's like I have to say no a lot, basically. And it's actually, in that way, it's sort of to my favor. Now I know all the things that forms can and can't do, so I can just kind of shut down my designer for technical reasons, saying nothing about the fact that even if it were possible, it would take me like 30 hours to do. So anyway. That's sort of the silver lining to all the limitations of web stuff, because you can say no to your ambitious designer a lot more. Forms in the mobile web, what else? So another thing is that, you know, getting things vertically laid out and positioned correctly always kind of sucks. If you're anything like me, you probably have to look it up every time that you need to center something, and maybe you're going to do the hack with the negative 50% vertical or matrix and shit. But it's even worse when you don't really know for sure how tall your keyboard's going to be when it opens up. So that constrains you even more. So there's a whole lot of no going around when you start designing this stuff. So one of the best remedies for forms is to not put them in your app at all. No form is better than a, you know, nicely animating, perfectly whatever auto-focusing form. But like I said, they're already kind of a crappy UI. If you're making your user constantly type in stuff, they're probably going to get bored of it pretty quickly. And you know, if there's any other sort of clever way that you can get this information out of the user, whether it's like a half form with some autocomplete, or they're swiping through something and picking something that's got a big nice red button rather than typing a bunch of tiny little keyboard buttons until something works, you should always try to find the formless way of doing something. I think that's true for desktop or mobile, but it's also just going to save you just a ton of heartache trying to get that working in mobile. And I don't even really think the experience is that good if you're doing native stuff either. It's just one of those things that's always kind of going to suck. So avoid it and make your users feel better while also making your own developers feel better. It's something you should try. So this is kind of something that I've tried in my app. It's sort of a weird, is it a remedy? I don't know. But I just like to say that, you know, it's the more complex things you try to do, it always gets a little bit more difficult. And there's weird rules around iOS and Android. If you try to bring up a form, maybe you got to pick the right kind of witchcraft choice of attributes to get it to show up as a number pad. And even then, that's a different keyboard height than the other things that you've already maybe hardwired into your app. And So one of the things that kind of helped in my app, and that I probably had a lot of doubts about at first, was actually just making a custom HTML, CSS, JavaScript number pad whose height I actually can control and all these other features I can control, and just throw it into the app. And much to my surprise, it actually feels pretty good. I guess it doesn't feel good if you're sort of, does it feel like native, does it look like native? No, it's going to look like your little HTML, CSS, JavaScript keyboard. But there's lots of clever stuff that you can do with it that you can't do with just a normal native keyboard. So for instance, we kind of ripped off this little credit card, debit card entry from Stripe, maybe, some way? Square. And the idea is, you know, you type in all the numbers and all this stuff. I'm cheating right now because I'm obviously typing in this stuff, but these are real buttons at the bottom. And, oh, there's one more page I want to show. But this whole interaction, these aren't real fields, these aren't real input things, or just some divs cleverly styled to look like they are forms. And getting this to work in sort of like manually managing your focus, and it was a little annoying, but honestly it was pretty fun to get working. And beyond the fact that you can't actually click a specific place in the caret, which is, I don't know, I mean, honestly that would be like 1% of cases anyway, we ended up being able to get this pretty decent.
So the caret is an animation.
The caret is a blinking border right. Yes, find my app. There you go. Animate blink. So anyway.
1990 calls.
1990? Well, they still have blinking cursors. That's not just the blink tag. So anyway, that's one example of where you get. But this actually, that little form performs better than the square one. The square one has a lot of weird corner cases where it just kind of focuses the wrong thing, or you can't go back. And ours manages to work better than that, just because it just happened to be just the right amount of constraints to give us the freedom to do a more manual version, and then skip all of the horrible nonsense of not knowing how big anything's going to be and not knowing how to vertically lay things out. The other place that it's useful, that kind of shows itself, is when you're actually, I'm kind of zooming through everything, but the idea of this app is that you geolocate your nearest store that you can actually go into and shop at. These are here because you can't scan, and there's no actual scanner attached to this thing until it's in your Cordova app. But if you want to type in like the code for an apple, or you scan an apple or something like that, you'll need to enter the weight. And one of the nice things that you can do if you've got complete control over this keyboard is you can provide a little bit more validation feedback before they've actually typed anything. So for instance, it doesn't make sense to have more than one decimal point. Or actually, is this a place where you use commas instead of decimal points for numbers?
Yeah.
Commas. I haven't internationalized this yet, and of course the first place I demonstrated is Amsterdam. You know, little things like your decimal point goes away, so you don't type that in again, and then we don't have to awkwardly do some like prevent default stuff if we guess that the next character or whatever. It's not fun stuff to think about. But like, if you type in too much, then we don't want any more than like 2 levels of precision. We don't want you to be like, oh, I just want 1.11113 pounds of this apple. That doesn't make sense. So we just kind of preemptively stop people. We give them feedback for why tapping this stuff isn't working, because we can fade out various keys. And as far as I know, you can't really do that if you're trying to go all native. So that's kind of a nice sort of alternative if you can find a way to do it. It's kind of specific to number pad stuff, because I don't think you'd actually want to do this with, all 57 whatever letters in the alphabet. I don't know why.
26.
26? I thought it was different in Europe.
What's the user feedback on the manual keyboard?
Surrounded high fives and 5-star ratings. I don't know. I think no one's dropped off at that point. And the earlier version that we basically had a chance of like 3 weeks of early alpha beta testing this app, and the Protus was something that a lot of people got stuck on, and a lot of it just had to do with just awkward keyboard interactions, and we were sort of constrained by not being able to autofocus, and when they did, they type in a bunch of junk characters because you don't have a lot of control over that. So since getting this, we've kind of gotten rid of all that drop off. So people seem to be happy with it. So another thing, I don't really have an example of this, but any sort of, if you're trying to animate in a field that you're autofocusing at the same time, it's just kind of makes both Android and iOS, in my experience, kind of flip out. And you've kind of got to, if you're going to do it, you should animate it in, wait till it's stopped, and then focus in, but that's kind of tricky. So if you have a situation where maybe you're tempted to put just like a bunch of inputs in a row, it might just be a better user experience to sort of swap that to be like one input per frame, and then keep that same input in the same place. And you can either just like animate your titles and your submit buttons around it and reuse literally the exact same input element to get rid of all sorts of weird rendering layout issues, or you can animate, or you can render a new input field, but within that same event loop focus it, because one of the main limitations with mobile focusing stuff is that unless it's connected to a user tapping or doing something, you can't just focus after like a set timeout. It's just lots of annoying rules. I can't even keep them all in my head. I just have a sense at this point of it's just going to be impossible. So this is a very interesting example. I don't really have one set up, but it's something to be aware of as an alternative. So kind of number 2 reason why mobile web development is hard is that concur is hard-NC, or in other words, concurrency is hard. But in the desktop setting, you don't really notice it as much, and it kind of lets you get away with a lot more things than than mobile is going to do. So by concurrency in sort of mobile web development, I just mean handling all the different UI events that can happen at a given time. So especially when there's async data loading, what happens if you keep on clicking the load button if you've already sent out to Ajax and whatnot, and also what happens if you click a button while the transitioning animation is underway. It's just a lot of stuff that you have to think about when the desktop assumptions are different. It's maybe not as crucial as it is in mobile that everything slide and move around, and maybe that's almost a bad thing in a desktop setting. But in mobile, it's like that's your bread and butter. You have to use that. You have to solve that problem all the time. And I still go home and my mom, I'll watch her on the Internet Explorer double-click every link. That's the ways that people will just, what seems natural to some people is just totally what you've not built your app around, and then put it in the hands of somebody and they're just breaking it in a million different ways. So that comes up a lot more in mobile even than the whole double-clicking thing. So I think one of the reasons it's so much easier on the desktop to sort of let kind of flimsy, leaky, concurrency-ish code happen on desktop is that your current concurrency is kind of limited by the fact that you're actually physically often moving a mouse or at least a trackpad and clicking that and then clicking that and clicking that, and in that time between these different buttons, it's already performed the animation or maybe even the data loading or whatnot. But when you just got this little tiny little interface, you can just like slap it, and you're causing like 5 different buttons to fire at like opposite corners of the screen. So it's really easy to type submit and the back button at the same time, and then your QA person is just constantly hitting reject on Pivotal Tracker, and it's just very debilitating. But so you need some kind of solution to that, and it's just something that you can, if you're in a hurry, you don't really always need to solve it in the desktop setup because it's just not going to come up. So like I said, mobile, it's kind of just like the Wild West when it comes to everything just firing events at any given point and not when you expect it. And it's also just like way easier to exploit. And so sort of another reason, kind of on top of the desktop being easier, is that in browser you often have some kind of loading bars or status. You can tell when images are loading because you clicked the thing. It's feedback that you don't have to put into your app, but it's just you kind of get it for free because you're in your desktop environment. And particularly when you're working with Cordova, when you've basically stripped all of the browser Chrome away and it's just only your web app, you have no feedback that anything's loading at all. It's honestly a lot of work to make it seem like your app is alive. And it just takes a little bit of just loading spinner here and there, some changing of text here and there, but it's a lot of work you wouldn't have to do in desktop, because desktop kind of just gives you some stuff for free. Assumptions are just kind of different. So approach I personally took, and at some point it'd be nice that you put this into an add-on, but it's also something I've seen other people do, is that you should basically like already in Ember testing, there's a lot of facilities that kind of let you know when asynchronous things are happening. So if there's these async helpers such as click, and then fill in this form, then submit, and then wait, and it kind of queues things up and runs every one of those commands once your app is idle, but it has some defaults built into Ember testing of like what idle means. So it means your router isn't currently like blocked on a promise. It means some other crucial promises aren't waiting to be resolved. And you know, if you're using an animation library like Liquid Fire, you might want to add animations to help kind of describe what that resting state is. So you can kind of take that similar approach with how you dispatch events throughout your app, because Ember's kind of has this built-in thing called the event dispatcher, and it's easy enough to kind of hack into that and reopen it, and something a little more first class would be nice. Also, Eric, I don't know if you've had to deal with this stuff before, but if I'm just kind of saying horrible things, you can kind of correct me at any point. But yeah, like I said, event dispatcher is kind of the thing that says, okay, an event came in, delegate it to this view, but it's very easy to find a place where you can say, okay, I literally just fired a tap event, you know, 100 milliseconds ago, probably the user didn't mean to do that, so ignore that one. Or maybe even buffer it and save it for later. It just gives you a lot of flexibility to sort of prevent double taps, or prevent like someone tapping the back button right after clicking submit on a form. I mean, ideally you should hide it, but still, it's just, you kind of want both the visual stuff and the event handling stuff to be aware of like what is async, what is your app in motion that you don't want to handle these events in that time. I'll say a little bit about this. Who's heard of reactive extensions, RX? Really, nobody? Wow. I'm kind of known as this sort of RX fanboy on the Ember core team, kind of eagerly trying to get people to use it and consider like maybe putting into Ember. I don't think it's going to happen at this point. I personally wouldn't want to do it. But without saying, you know, I probably had like 3 slides on this thing. RX is a very difficult thing to describe. It is almost like a super abstraction above promises. So who uses promises? Quick show of hands. Okay, so it's pretty commonplace at this point. Maybe 2 years ago when it first came out, it was very like mind-bending, but eventually people came around with the idea that not having these deeply nested callbacks actually leads to some better structuring of a lot of your asynchronous logic, particularly in the ways that errors are handled and the ways that errors are propagated. It almost makes try-catch work in an async setting. But I guess maybe the easiest way to describe RX is a collection of a bunch of different kind of data types that all work together, but all sort of revolves around this one data type, or one structure, I don't know what to call it, called an observable. And it's something that some people, and I think TC39 are really trying to get, or yes, ECMA, I'm really bad at remembering all the different things, but some people really want to be a part of Ember in the same, I'm going to start over, the jet lag is getting me. Sorry, rewind. Observables, much like promises, have made their way into ECMAScript. There are some people that are really trying to get this into ES7. And whether it happens or not, I'm not sure. I personally think it's
the async await kind of thing, or?
It ties into that a little bit, but it's more just, let me sort of describe what this is. So if you can imagine, I mean, a promise is an eventual value, and it's a single value. I mean, maybe you could return an array, but it's basically you get that eventual value all at once, and then it's done. The promise is resolved. There's nothing that's going to fire or send any more data after that. And that's a very useful primitive to have in so many cases. And I would say that an RX observable is, rather than it just being a scalar eventual value, it's a stream of values that can fire over time. And you know, while it might be more of a trickier default that you would be using a vector of multiple values as your kind of default primitive, you can sort of understand how it's easy to represent a scalar value with just being like a single value of that vector. So when I say it's a super abstraction of promises, I'm saying that you can model promises using observables, and it has a few other kind of niceties that are, honestly, I would recommend just going on YouTube and looking up maybe a sort of Netflix video on observables, because the sort of canonical example is typing in autocomplete, and you know, you want to fire an AJAX response, you know, pretty much every letter that you type, but if you type a bunch of letters, you don't want to fire like 6 in the period of like 10 milliseconds, so you want to debounce it a little bit, and just all the different ways, all the different things that can bite you when you're dealing with async kind of show up a lot in that sort of simple autocomplete example. And so you end up debouncing all of these events, and then if you fire off a new Ajax event or request, you want to ignore the ones before it because the timing, an earlier Ajax request might come back later than a later, like all this sort of concurrency hell that I'm talking about is something that you can iron out very easily with observables that you can't quite do with promises, because promises are both very eager and fire right away, and once you have a promise that's already doing its work, you can't really cancel it. And so anyway, this is a little hand wavy because it is honestly just really hard to give a 2-second introduction to these things, but I use them in my app. And this is a quick little example.
Yeah, it's,
What's that?
no, the display
Oh, the
is
blur,
just-
the jump view is a little,
like-
we turned it down to 1.
This is beyond.
Yeah, turn down the sober, please.
Yeah. I don't know, this might not even be worth it.
Whatever, I'll read
post
it
these,
anyway.
quick overview. Observable timer. So this is basically
Yeah.
saying after 500 milliseconds.
I'll just see it as a test if I can still read it. So,
Yeah.
So if this dot deactivate observable becomes false, then it cancels the promise or something like that.
Yeah, that's the way of thinking about it. So basically, this is a piece of code because we have these little tutorial modules in our app. If someone gets to the scan page and they have no idea what they're looking at, they don't know that they're supposed to start scanning barcodes and putting items in their bag. We have something that kind of pops up after 5 seconds. It's just like scan items, blah blah blah, put it in your bag. But we don't want that to come up if in that time you actually scan an item. It's going to be very annoying if you scan an item and it's just like, hey, did you know you can scan items? Also, you don't want that modal to come up if you've already left that route. If you've already, we use routes heavily in our app just because it's any other, like you would any Ember app. But if you go to the scan page and then you go back to the page before it, you don't want to get a tutorial popping up for the scan page. And if you try to actually implement this using, I don't know, set timeout or promises, you end up having to write a lot of logic that's like, if I've done, okay, at the time that it's supposed to fire, has this thing happened, has this thing happened? And what observables let you do is kind of compose these together in a really succinct way. Kind of, I mean, it's still like 7 lines of code, but it's like if I had to write the state machine to handle all these cases in which a modal shouldn't fire up, it'd be a lot more code and it'd be a lot more error prone. So what this is saying is build up this observable that fires after 5 seconds, just fires like any value. It doesn't even really matter. It's not like the value is used here. It's this little subscribe function doesn't take anything. It's just like, boop, some value happened, go do your thing. So what this is saying is that after 5 seconds, fire a value, but produce another observable where you're like, you don't take any values if this thing in the meantime fires. Deactivate is something that kind of hardwired into our app to fire every time that the route deactivate hook fires. And also take until that a scan has actually come through. And what this basically means is that after 5 seconds, if none of these things have happened, this will fire. But if any of these things have happened, the subscription basically cancels itself. It's done. It terminated early because one of these things fired. This little callback never fires. It just kind of just very magically cleans up after itself in a way that it would be very hard to do, even with promises. Even though promises are a really nice abstraction. So I really like this stuff. I use it all the time in my app. I just can't honestly personally say that this is just the ideal, perfect Ember API that I want to share with the world. I'm still honestly letting some of this stuff brew and change a little bit before I kind of propose to the core team like what is something that I'd actually want people to use. Because when you actually start trying to learn observables, there's like a bajillion different little operators like take until and flat map latest and these horribly named things by people that aren't really good at coming up with good, well-named APIs for stuff. But so it's my personal goal to take this, which I like, and I'm glad I've finally been able to make sense of it, but make it something that has that sort of normal Ember sheen to it. Because most people have come to expect some really nice APIs from Ember. I don't think this is a nice API. I just think it's way better than all of the error-prone state machining logic that I'd have to write, even if I were using promises. Come back.
There it is.
Alright. So anyway, last slide I have an RX. Before I say it's not the answer. But so one of the niceties of RX is that once you have a chain of promises, and you can't really stop it. It's like an eventual value, and then you produce another eventual value based on that. And all of these things, all of these little promises are going to be running their logic no matter what, because just by sheer nature of them existing. But for observables, like I sort of showed in this previous slide, they kind of know when no one's listening to their value anymore, and they can just kind of stop what they're doing. And that's a really nice property to have in a lot of code, at least that I'm writing. Whereas if you had to try to do that in promised land, every sort of link of that promise chain would have to kind of keep on checking, like, should I keep on going? Should I keep on going? Has the user gone away? Blah, 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 blah. And that kind of pollutes a lot of that code with kind of unrelated logic. So that's why I like RX so much, is that it just nails that use case, even though it's pretty tricky. So again, if this wasn't a good introduction to RX, I definitely again would encourage just checking out the Netflix videos that they have on observables. They're really easy to understand, or at least they make it seem really easy to understand. RX is still a very difficult, unwieldy library, but it does the thing very, very, very well that you're not going to find in the promises. So probably not the answer. Probably a little too cumbersome. We might have something. So for instance, in HTML bars and in the new Glimmer engine, we're making heavy use of these new streams that, in some ways sound like they have some little overlap with like what an observable is, but a lot of the semantics are quite different. And maybe the answer, what will end up being something that we make first class for managing these subscriptions and canceling things and doing all this stuff that I think RX does really well, it might come from member streams. People let the community sort of work that out a bit, and I'll do my best to do the same. So I use it all the time. If you want to use RX in your Ember CLI apps, there's an add-on called Ember CLI RX, and there's also a globals mode version just called Ember RX that you can use. That's maintained by Ben Lesh, and I've added a few things to it. Well, this is actually going a little longer than I intended, but sort of the last thing I'd say about mobile web dev stuff is just that like layout is very hard. Like as I mentioned before, you have keyboards whose heights vary, and you don't know what they're going to be until they're open. And just personally in my app, I was able to make a very sort of bare bones, poor man's vertical layout component. And one of the things that made that easy is the fact that in like the last few months, we have components that support these block params here. So if anyone's done any Ruby development, you use blocks all the time, and blocks can accept a value from whoever is invoking them. So if you're going to loop over an array and then print out every value of that array, you basically say SumArray.each, and then pass it that block of code that prints it out, and then that block of code is going to get invoked every single time with this block param. It was actually pretty easy to, because in my code I basically had some text that wasn't super important, but we wanted to display it if there actually was space for it. If there wasn't, we didn't want it taking up any layout room because we didn't really have a whole lot of real estate to work with. So there's something in my app that literally checks like, okay, like 300, that's not a beautiful like hardwired thing to have in there, but it's not much different than a media query, but this makes it easier to do it all in JavaScript, particularly with working with vertical heights. And it makes use of that block params feature that's still pretty unique to Ember. So maybe the last thing I'd demo is whether or not I'm using this vertical layout component or not. Something that was actually surprisingly easy to hook into, but has made my development work a little better, is just being able to use a different device and have things automatically resize. You can see, like this isn't, I'm hoping that most people that use our app don't have iPhone 4 because I don't like how this looks, but at least it does fit for those people that still have iPhone 4s, and I can confidently just change through this stuff and just make sure that everything changes. Oh, and the nice thing is that on iOS, you've got to, since iOS 7, you've got to actually make room in your app for this little status bar at the top. But you don't have to do that for the Nexus 5, so it's really easy to just sort of sniff the fake user agent that Google Chrome is going to change up on you, and it's basically every time that you have a resize event come through, you can kind of remove all the stuff that doesn't make sense anymore. So every time that I do a new page, I'm just going through these things to this Google Nexus and iPhone 5 and iPhone 4 and making sure all this stuff looks okay, and that layout component I was telling you about definitely makes things easier for making sure there's a proper amount of spacing between this and that. So again, a little bit of hand waviness because I've been a very busy person with startup stuff, and I sort of have a giant to-do list of just taking all the crap that we've learned and beyond just presenting it in Amsterdam once every decade. I might actually put it into an add-on or something. Eric's been also doing a lot of work on a UI library kind of on top of Ember, so I'll probably bug him and exploit his talents to sort of make sure whatever he adds to his library helps my app. So anyway, that's pretty much, let's grab you.